Okay. All right. So I know a couple more people are still coming in. Give me a little bit, because I think because the weather's probably messing up some of the issues maybe with some people with their internet service and stuff. So just give me a second. All right. So, okay. We'll find where I want to start and then we'll get started. Okay. Well, welcome back after you guys had a little bit of a break. So we're back at it this week. We are actually jumping into the skeletal system tonight. So we'll talk about that. And this is, let's see, we are on week 9. So this is March 15th that week. You guys are going to complete your quiz 6 by March 22nd. You'll submit your hyperdoc on March 21st. You guys just had an exam. Mr. Anderson's actually going to jump on at the end of class and he's going to talk about the written portion and some of the things with the exam like he did last time. So we'll stop at the end and allow for him to get on, and then we'll discuss all of what he wants to discuss with the exam. So we will come back to that. These are the due dates. Like I said, we're on week 9. So if you're looking here, we've got skeletal system 1, we're doing a skeletal system 2. You guys are doing your group project presentation 2 weeks from now. So if you have any questions or you have any concerns, you guys just need to let me know. We need to maybe get together. You guys do a practice run on sharing your screen or how you want to, you know, present to everyone. That's perfectly fine if you're wanting to use PowerPoint or some other system. And maybe if you're having any type of issues and you guys want to kind of do a little practice run, like I said, that's perfectly fine with me. I'm happy to do so. I know that would be something that would make me feel better personally. So if that's something you guys want to do, just shoot me a text, shoot me an email, let me know what you're thinking, and that's perfectly fine. So just be ready for the group presentation. You guys need to practice with your groups if you're having issues with your group or if you've lost members because they dropped the class. Just let me know if you guys have to reassign, or I need to reassign, I should say, different tasks for each members. Then just, like I said, shoot me an email and I'll respond back and we'll just reorganize whatever, you know, needs to be done or what's not been done, I should say. I am still going through some of the hyperdocs to get your grades in. If you don't have a grade, I will be looking through to get you a grade. So I'm looking through those. Don't feel like if you don't have a grade that I'm not intending to go through that to evaluate it. So just give me a little bit of time and I'll get there. So if you guys, like I said, grades or anything with the hyperdoc for the presentation, please reach out to me. Okay, anything that you have questions about. But like I said, I'm jumping through the grades, trying to get those completed with the hyperdocs, and then with the group presentation, if you need me before you have to present, please reach out to me. I'm perfectly fine with it. Okay. All right. So now I'm actually going to jump into and show you guys our handout for tonight. Because our handout, we're just going over skeletal system. However, you'll have a lab just on the muscles. So we are going to focus on 2 parts of musculoskeletal, okay? But it's divided up into the skeletal system and the muscle system. So you've really got 4 parts going over musculoskeletal. And you'll see what I mean in a little bit. All right, so let's get to the handout. And I think you guys will be pleasantly surprised. There's not a ton of information, but there is a lot of memorization that you'll have to be responsible for. Your hyperdoc will walk you through it. This will help you as you get through, as we talk about the skeletal system. I've got some images on here that I want to point out because I know there are certain things you need to know for the hyperdoc. So I'm going to make an emphasis on those, okay? So let's jump into it. This is, like I said, it's the musculoskeletal handout, all right? This is all used for skeletal system 1, the muscular system 1, and then I'll post next week musculoskeletal 2. So we will come back to this handout when we talk about the muscles for muscle 1, or I should say muscular system 1, okay? All right. So first off, we're going to talk about some generalizations of the musculoskeletal system. And you talk about the skeletal system, we want to think about a framework, okay? So it's constructed of bone and cartilage. Now, in embryos, and you guys know in babies or children that are very young, up to about the age of, we'll say about 3, you guys notice that, for example, the bones of their skull, um, some of the bones are not fully formed. You kind of notice the skull more than anything, that kids can bump their head and put an indentation, for example. These bones are not calcified. They aren't, I should say, bones. It's cartilage at this point. They are going to be bones, but they are not calcified. Okay. So the cartilage will be replaced by bone in the adult. However, cartilage is going to persist in certain areas. Okay. And we all know where there's cartilage in our body. We know that our ears, the bridge of our nose, our larynx, trachea, joints, and the part of the ribs where they attach to the sternum. We have already talked about the tissue type cartilage. We've talked about connective tissue. This is under that classification. We've looked at it. We know the different cell types. You were responsible for it to be able to identify it. So I want you to think about the types of cartilage we looked at when we talked about connective tissue. And as we go over this and we talk about the different types located in different areas, remind yourself, what did this tissue look like? Okay. Try to remind yourself. All right. So as we talk about the cartilage, which we'll come back to, we do want to spend some time on bone also. And when we talk about bone, I want you guys to think about bone is not just a calcified, stored calcium hard tissue. Okay. We already looked at it before, but this is the time we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it and understanding what bone is. Remember that bone is a living tissue. So it's going to have a blood supply. So it's going to have the vessels, it's going to have lymphatic vessels throughout it because it needs to be supplied by blood. It's a living tissue. And also, bone is also going to have debris or have waste it needs to get rid of. The lymphatic system needs to take back and drain out. Okay. And the other thing you need to think about with bone is, yes, bone is hard, but bone is living and it gets remodeled and broken down and reformed every few months. This is happening. Okay. So I want you guys to think about this. This bone, the bones that you have, you were able to grow, right, and get taller as through development. So you must know that bone can be remodeled. It makes sense. That it's something that I feel like people take for granted. Okay. But bone can remodel and it does. But bone, usually what happens is bone will remodel exactly where it knows it should go. So if you've had a problem with a bone or a defect, it will try to remodel the best it can. In fact, it will lay down more bone if there's been an injury to harden that area so there's no more injuries. Okay. So think about bone as a living tissue. It's broken down, it's rebuilt. Okay. It has blood supply, it has lymphatic supply. These are the things I want you to think about. Okay. Now, we're going to scroll down and we're going to talk about where is cartilage found. And then I'm going to mention the cartilage that we had to know for the tissues. When you had to learn them about the connective tissue, you had all of these tissues that are going to be listed here. So first off, let's talk about where is cartilage found in the skeletal system. You have articular cartilage, that's in between the bones to create a joint. You have costal cartilage, which is the attachments from the ribs to the sternum. You have laryngeal cartilage for your larynx, your voice box. You have your tracheal bronchial cartilage. That's going to be your trachea and bronchial tubes of your lungs. Okay. You have your nasal cartilage, which everybody can kind of point at their nose and they realize, ooh, that's kind of, yeah, okay. You wouldn't want anything bony there. You might break it off for that matter, and you need some expansion. We have intervertebral disc, which I know that you're aware of. We have the disc, and the discs are made of a certain type of cartilage, right? Found in that area. So we're going to talk about that in a second below. Cartilage of the external ear. Well, you probably remember the elastic cartilage, ear elastic, right? And we have that listed below. So if you look at the different types of cartilage that we had discussed in the past, we talked about the hyaline cartilage. The hyaline cartilage is going to be the cartilage you're going to find in a child where if they don't have that bone already formed, they're not an adult, for example, um, they are going to have a lot of hyaline cartilage, but over time, so a new baby is going to have a ton of hyaline cartilage, but over time, it's going to turn into bone. And then it's going to leave the hyaline cartilage in certain areas. So hyaline cartilage, for example, it's going to be found where the ribs attach. It's in many areas. That's the articular cartilage, for example. So you've got hyaline cartilage in it's probably the most, I should say, most common cartilage that you would have to identify. Let's put it that way. The elastic cartilage, you guys already know, is the ear, whereas elastic cartilage, you can pull it. Your epiglottis, where it closes off when you swallow, it's trying to close off the tube to the trachea, okay? The tube to your lungs. The fibrocartilage is the type of cartilage that's found in the intervertebral disc. It's also found in the meniscus of the knee. So it's a good supportive pressure cartilage. We'll talk about the disc in a little bit, but that's where fibrocartilage is found in those two areas mainly. Okay. So all of these different tissue types we've talked about, but then now hopefully you'll be able to point them out and go, oh, that's the type of cartilage and that's where it's found. Okay. So we'll spend a little bit of time with that. Especially the disc, because we go through the vertebral column, for example. All right. Now, here are some examples. Not that I needed to tell you or reiterate this, I mean, again, but this is some examples just with some pictures, just as a reminder if you're looking back at the handout. Okay. All right. Now, let's talk about bones. All right, we've already talked about bone in general. We've talked about its ability to break down, which you're going to talk about in lecture. How does it break down? How does it remodel? We've talked about it having good blood supply, good lymphatic vessels and drainage from the bone, okay? Because, and it's got nerves. I didn't mention the nerves, but of course it has nerves. You break a bone, you can feel it, right? So it is a living tissue. It is remodeled, okay? So when we look at bone, we are going to classify bone into 206 bones. But this is what I want you guys to realize. Yes, there are 206 bones across the board. If I was to go, let me count my obvious bones that I have. Let me count your obvious bones that you have. I'm going to count 206 bones. Now, does it mean that everybody actually has exactly 206 bones? No, there are some very small bones, which we're going to talk about in a second, that are under the irregularly shaped bones that could be a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on who you're looking at. Okay, so we differ a little bit in our very small bones that we have throughout our body. Okay, but the obvious bones that we are able to see are 206 bones. So that's what you need to know. It's 206 bones, okay? Now, the bones are divided up into two types of osseous tissue. The first one is called compact bone. Compact bone meaning it is compact and homogeneous throughout. It has no open spaces, no irregularities. It is completely homogeneous throughout, okay? The spongy bone or cancellous bone is the other type of bone, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. Okay, so if you're looking at this image, hold on, I'm going to draw on it for a second. So if you're looking at this image, this would be the compact bone. This is going to be the cancellous, or we also use the term spongy bone. Compact bone, because of course it's the same throughout. There's no holes, no deviations, no irregularities. It is completely the same throughout. But in the spongy bone or cancellous bone, we have a lot of openings, a lot of open space. It looks like a sponge, okay? If you're looking at bones and you're comparing them, typically if we were in lab and we were talking about not looking at an image, but if we were face to face, I would have given you a bone and I would have said, hey, can you compare the compact to the spongy bone? I would have shown you a real one where you could be able to, touch it and see it for yourself. But what I want you to understand is the compact bone is going to be mainly on the outside. If you find spongy bone, you're going to find it on the inside, okay, of that bone. So the spongy bone, when you think about it, we also form red blood cells, okay? We have hematopoiesis where we're forming all these blood cells, some of these white cells. are going to come out and they're going to be formed here. So there's a lot of activity happening in the open space, the lumen, or even the spongy or cancellous bone, those areas where there's space for blood to be formed. Okay. So remember that your bone marrow is found it's inside your bones where we form the blood. Okay. So that's something I want you guys to be able to point out or be able to be aware of: the spongy bones on the inside, the compact bones found on the outside. Depending on what types of bones we're looking at, it may vary a little bit how much compact bone we have. We may have a little bit more spongy bone, or we may have more compact bone compared to spongy bone. Okay, so those are some things to think about. And to compare. And if you have any questions about that, or if you want to pull up images, you can do so. There are some good images too online and in your book. Okay, so if you need to look at another image of that, just let me know and I can post some. All right, let me clear my drawing. Okay. All right, now the other thing I want to talk about, we were already leading into, is bones are all shaped differently. Okay. So there are general classifications of the shape of bones. Okay, there's long bones, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones. The main ones you're going to be familiar with are the long bones. Okay, just like we're going to talk about your humerus or your femur. Okay, your tibia, your fibula. Those are long bones. Okay, short bones are cubed-like. They are very compacted bones. Okay, and those are like the tarsals and carpals that we're going to discuss. All right, and that's going to be next week. We'll talk about those. Flat bones are going to be like little wafers. Those are going to be like the bones found on the top of your skull bones that we're going to talk about tonight. Irregular bones, those are going to be the bones that mainly, when you think about it, are like your vertebrae. They're irregularly shaped. And then under irregular bones, there's two more classifications known as sesamoid bones, which are irregular shaped bones that are found in tendons. Your patella, which is your kneecap, that is a sesamoid bone. It's found inside of a tendon. You have a lot more sesamoid bones, but we don't count them in the classification of the 206. Okay. You have other sesamoid bones, but like I said, they're very small and they may differ from your count of bones and my count of bones of these small irregular bones. Then there's the Wormian or sutural bones. Those are the bones that are found between the cranial bones, found in between the flat bones that are wafer-like that create your skull. And they're very small. And like I said, they deviate in number from you to me. Okay. All right. Move on. So we'll get some good examples of those here in just a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about bone markings. Okay, so bone markings is important because I want you guys to be able to understand that there are certain terms that we use over and over again, whether it's on one bone or another. You're going to see these terms and you're going to see them repeated. You're eventually, even if I didn't have this little diagram here, you were eventually going to figure out, that's what this word means. It means, in general, a large projection or roughened projection, or it could be, and we'll talk through these, or it's a line, or it's a hole in the bone, or it's then we use these same terms over and over. So when we're looking at a bone, we're looking at the different markings found on that bone, and we still have to name the marking on the particular bone, for example. All right, so here are the examples. The first one, let me underline them as I go through them. This is for tuberosity. Tuberosity is a large rounded projection that could be roughened, okay? And there are examples over here. So this right here, the ischial tuberosity, for example. A crest is going to be a narrow ridge of a bone, like a prominent area. So here's the iliac crest found here. Okay, that's your hip bone that you can feel if you press your hand on your hip. That's a crest. Okay, a trochanter is a very large, blunt, irregular shaped process. So we'll look at those. Underline it, since we just talked about it. Okay, so these are trochanters. You see how they're large, irregularly shaped. Okay, that's on the femur. It's that big thigh bone. A line is just simply a line. Okay, and there's one down here. I feel like if I move this, I'm going to move it out of the view, but I'll come down and look at it in a second with you. A tubercle is a small rounded projection or process. Okay, and I have a picture of it below too, and we'll look at it in a second. Let's see. I want to skip epicondyle for right now. Spine, for example, there's the ischial spine over here. It just creates a little spine that projects out. A process is any bony providence that projects out. Okay. So you've got the spinous process on the back of the vertebrae. You'll also have transverse processes that are on the sides of the vertebrae that we'll look at tonight too. Okay, let me clear this and move down. Okay. All right, now here's some other terms you may be somewhat familiar with. The head of a bone. I see your question. Hold on. What's the difference between the spine and the process? The spine, even though it's not shown really well in this image, it's going to basically be like a line, but it's a line that projects out. It's not a line that goes in, okay? I guess that's not probably a good example because the spine, you'll see some other examples of it, not many, but it will be like a line that projects out, if that makes sense. Okay. When we use the term just line, it's a line that's a indentation into that bone. And I'll show you an example of that. But that's a great question. All right. So head, like here's the head of the bone. I've got an example above too. This is not a perfect example. There's a head up top. I'm going to move back up in a second and show it to you. A facet is a flat, smooth, flat articulation, like a flat surface to a flat surface is what that is. For example, this is not shown here, but on a rib, oh yeah, here it is, the facet. I just circled it, duh. Head, technically this is the head, but the flat surface is the facet, if that makes sense. The head is the head of the bone, okay, the top of the bone. Okay, and we'll look at that, more examples in a second. A facet is a flat surface that's going to meet another flat surface of that bone. A condyle, this is an example, your mandible that fits into a depression of the maxilla bone, okay? This is the mandible, how it goes in, creates that TMJ, the temporomandibular joint, and it creates kind of like a little hinge that sits up in a little deviation or depression, okay? So that's called a condyle. So here's the other condyle on the other side, okay? A groove, we'll look at this in a second too. It's a furrow, meaning it's a depression into the bone, okay? A fissure, narrow slit-like opening, but it's a full opening. Instead of it being like a hole that would be an opening, it's going to be a slit opening, just like around with your eye sockets. We'll look at those. That's a good example of a fissure. A foramen is just a hole in the bone. Okay, I'm going to clear this and we'll move down. Okay, actually, let's move up because I want to show you some other examples. All right, since we've already talked about them. Okay, this would be the head. We haven't talked about the neck of a bone, but this would be, for example, the neck where it comes in, it creates a neck just like your head, and your neck is smaller than your head. Your head is a rounded, big top of the bone projection, for example, just like think about your head. Okay, so that's the head of the bone. Okay, this would be the neck where I did the arrow. Down here at the bottom, these are condyles because they create almost like a little hinge, but they fit into like a depression. And we'll look at examples of those, or quite a bit examples of a condyle fitting into a fossa, for example. If a condyle has a condyle on top of it, for example, where it shoots out, you'll have, for example, and we'll look at this in a second, you'll have what they call epicondyle. And I know that sounds crazy, but here's epicondyle, and it says raised area on or above a condyle, okay? And I'll show you when we scroll down. I think there's a good example of it. Okay. Move a little bit more down. All right. Now we've talked about all the way down to foramen, so let's look at those. Here's a groove. You can see the groove here. The The fossa is just a depression. So when it says fossa, it's a depression. Meatus is not just a hole, but it's a hole that creates a tunnel. Think of it that way. Meatus, and the definition says, let's see what it says, canal-like passage, okay? But it's a hole that creates a tunnel. So your ear canal is a meatus, for example. Here's a fissure we were talking about. This creates a line. See how it is? There's a fissure below, fissure above, and the eye socket, like this on the other side too. Those are fissures. Foramen, you can't really see it. It's just a hole in the bone, okay? All right, and then a sinus, for example, you're gonna think about the sinuses in your head. That's really the only place that you guys need to know about a sinus, where it's found, but it's a cavity within a bone. It has air or mucous membrane found inside, okay? Fossa, we talked about, it's a shallow basin or depression, okay? Shallow basin or depression. So these are terms you're gonna see. You're just gonna see them over and over again. Oh, notch, we haven't talked about a notch. Notch is indentation or edge of a bone. It indents into the bone. This is an example of a notch, but it's not a great big picture where you can see the notch, okay? There's only a couple places where we have notches on our bones, okay? But these terms you will see over and over again, but here's the part that I want you guys to realize. You do not have to memorize these terms, okay? Do you hear what I said? You do not have to memorize these terms. You will learn them as you're learning the bones. You will learn the markings for those bones, for example, okay? So you do not have to learn this chart. It's to help you. So if you have trouble learning these markings or what they mean, then I would go back to this little diagram or whatever you want to call it, this little image where it gives you the definitions, and look at the definition and look at some examples. Okay, that way it will help you as you're learning the markings, because sometimes people are going, well, what does that mean? What does that marking mean? How am I going to be able to remember this? Well, then come back to this and look at it and look at the definition and look at an example, okay? I really don't think you guys are going to have trouble with that, but this is just to help you and kind of help you along with understanding that there are markings on the bones. You are responsible for those. If they're on the hyperdoc, you need to know them. I put everything that I put on here, they're very generalized. So that way you'll be able to see the general bones and some of the markings, but I did not put very specific because I don't want you guys to learn things that you do not need to know for your exam, okay? Now, here's the first thing I want you guys to realize tonight as we're talking about bones, because now we're going to get into specific bones of the body that we're going to learn, okay? But tonight we're focusing on what we call the axial skeleton. You need to know what the axial skeleton is made of. This definition will come up again and again. So the axial skeleton is made up of the skull, vertebral column, and the bony thorax. You will have questions on that, I promise you, okay? All right, now let me clear that out and scroll down. So you need to know what the axial skeleton is, okay? And that's what we're focusing on tonight. I do not have the appendicular skeleton listed on this handout, but the axial skeleton is only the head, the vertebral column, and the bony thorax. But the appendicular skeleton, which we're going to talk about next week, is going to be the arms and the legs, everything attached to the axial skeleton. So that's going to be the arms and the legs. So next week, we'll talk about the appendicular skeleton. That's what we'll focus on. I didn't divide them out on this handout, but I'm wanting you to realize when we're talking about axial skeleton, we're only talking about what's listed in this image, okay? So here we have the skull, we have the rib cage, and we have the vertebral column. That's it. That's all we're focusing on tonight, okay? All right. That's just an image for you guys to just make sure that you understand that's what that means. That's what we're actually focusing for this lab. All right, now I'm going to go down. All right, we are going to talk about and look at the bones of the skull, but you need to realize that the skull is made up of two sets of bones, the cranium and the facial bones. So we'll look at the inside, so the bones outside the skull, and what's certain bones on the inside of the skull, not all of them, but we'll learn the two major ones you need to know, and then we'll talk about facial bones. Okay. Okay, so here's an example. You guys will be responsible of all these bones that are listed here. That's why I use this image. But keep in mind, now that you've learned about the brain and you've learned the different regions or lobes, I should say, of the brain, these have the same names. Frontal bone. They're named because they're named after the same area. Parietal bone. We will talk about sphenoid. You don't know what that is yet. Temporal bone, occipital bone, and there's one down below we're going to look at. Okay. Scroll down. The last one is the ethmoid bone. So we'll look at it separately. Okay, so all of these you know on this image except for the sphenoid and the ethmoid bone, okay? The sphenoid is going to be a bone that's on the inside. We can see just a little bit of it, which is what is represented here. This is part of it. This is like a wing of the sphenoid. This right here is part of the ethmoid bone. The reason we can't really see them, and I'll show it to you, is because they're entirely inside and you only see little parts of them, okay? But they're pretty big bones. All right, so let's go down, let's look. Front, so you'll have to know all of these also. Okay, so nasal bone, afraid if I draw on the image, I'm gonna mess it up, but the nasal bone is here in the blue. You do have lacrimal bones, just like you learned about your lacrimal gland that produces the tears. You have a little bit of bone on the inside. It's a lacrimal bone. Parietal bone, which you know the lobes. The sphenoid we will look at. This is not a helpful image. And of course, the frontal bone is absolutely shown well in this image, okay, because we're looking at the front. Temporal bone, we're looking at the side, but you're aware of that bone. Here's one of the bones you'll need to know, and it's just a side view. It's your cheekbones, your zygomatic bones, okay? The zygomatic bones form the cheekbones. Ethmoid bone, not really shown well. We'll look at it in a little bit. The maxilla, that's that upper portion, okay? As you can see, it's divided in 1, 2 sides, okay? You have a lot of bones, just like your nasal bones. You've got 2 sides, okay? Zygomatic bones, you've got 1, 2. Okay, so that's something you need to be aware of. Some bones are just one bone, and then some bones that we talk about, you've got them symmetrically on both sides. The mandible down at the bottom, we've already looked at the mandible. That was the one that had the condyles. It's going to fit up and form into or press into a fossa called your temporomandibular joint. Okay, that's your mandible that's doing that. All right, we're going to look at some more images. Okay. Here's the sphenoid bone. Notice it is a bat-shaped bone. Okay, you will need to know certain things like this in here. This is going to be on your handout. It's a little saddle that's found in this area, for example. It's where your pituitary sits. Okay, so that's where the little ball that hangs off, that's a master gland, your pituitary, it's going to sit into that little saddle. You'll have to know this. It's called the sella turcica. So you'll have to answer those things on the hyperdoc, okay, on that handout. So you guys will actually look at this, but this is the backbone, for example. You also have for example, it has little holes where your optic canals, or I should say, where your optic nerves run through, a little opening, okay? That's all this bone. The other bone, which I'll go ahead and draw it or wrap around it, I should say, is the ethmoid bone. I'm going to move down so you can see it. Okay. And it is that bone that I just circled. That's the ethmoid bone. And the ethmoid bone has a bunch of holes in it, okay, called olfactory foramina, because they're little holes found out throughout the bone, and it allows for smells to come up, and you have a bunch of your nerves that are sitting there for your olfactory nerves, these little, I should say, little axons that are sitting right there ready to receive and send information to the brain, okay, for different smells. So smells able to come up in your nose through this little ethmoid bone, through these little olfactory foramina, and you're getting these smells that are coming up, and you're able to stimulate your olfactory cranial nerves, okay? That olfactory nerve is that cranial nerve number 1 we had to learn. Okay, so that's the ethmoid bone. I'm going to draw around it again, just in case. Okay, so that's the ethmoid bone. All right, so we're going to move down. Like I said, you'll have questions about those sphenoid and the ethmoid. The other bone I want you guys to see, and this is just a very generalization of the skull and the bones on the inside that you need to know, but the other bone that's not attached to anything else, that's just literally sitting there in the neck, and it's not really considered a skull or facial bone, but it's called the hyoid bone. Okay, that's in the neck, the hyoid bone. So notice it's just sitting here, but it does have ligamentous attachments and muscles for the tongue that attach to it. All right, but it is a freestanding bone. It is the only fully freestanding bone. Okay, so that's the that's the hyoid bone. You just need to know what it looks like, and you need to know where it's found, and you need to know that it's not attached to any other bones. Okay, so you do need to know it's not attached to any other bones. All right, and it is in your neck, and it's not technically a cranial bone or a facial bone. It is just a bone that's found in the neck, and the tongue muscles attached to it, and it has some ligamentous attachments to it in the neck. But it does stand completely alone. It's kind of an odd bone. In fact, I know some chiropractors sometimes move it around, and you can kind of pop it, move it back and forth. It's really different. Let's put it that way. Okay, the vertebral column. Let's talk about it. All right, the vertebral column goes from the skull to the pelvis. All right, so it's going to form the majority of the axial skeleton. All right, it's going to protect the spinal cord, which we've already looked at the spinal cord. We've talked about it going through the vertebral foramina, or I should say the foramen, that big hole inside the vertebrae. It's going to run through that big hole, and it's going to follow through all the way through all 24 of these vertebrae. Okay, the vertebral column is divided up from the cervical, thoracic to the lumbar, and then you've got some fused vertebrae at the very bottom to form the sacrum and the coccyx. Okay, but we're going to look at each one of these and what do these vertebrae look like. So you've got 7 cervical vertebrae. So think about eating breakfast at 7. So they form the neck vertebrae, called your cervical vertebrae. And then there's 12 thoracic vertebrae, okay? And think about eating lunch at noon, right? Then there's 5 lumbar vertebrae. So think about eating dinner at 5. So breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5, okay? 7, 12, and 5. All right, so we're gonna look at those. Let me clear this. So if you look at this image, you will see that with the cervical vertebrae, you're going to see these nice curves, right? And the cervical vertebrae, you've got them divided up via C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7. Okay, that's how we reference them. We just put C1, C2, C3, C4. Okay, that's something that's super common. So I would just get familiar with that. But if you notice that the cervical vertebrae are kind of shaped, right? They create a curve. And then there's another curve created once you get to the thoracic vertebrae. And you can see they're notated by a T for thoracic, 1 through 12, okay, because there are 12. Then if you move down, you'll see that there are the lumbar vertebrae at the bottom, and we start with L for lumbar, L1, L2, L3, L4, and 5. Okay, and then at the very bottom, which I'll move down in just a second, you'll see the sacrum down at the bottom. Okay, and then we'll look at the coccyx in a second. One thing I want you guys to be able to see, that the spinal column creates these curves. It almost looks like an odd shaped S. It's not a true S. It's got more of a curve to it, but that continues, but it does kind of look like an S, right? What do you guys think would be the significance of creating a curve? Why don't we have just a very straight spinal column? Why do the vertebrae curve? What purpose or what function do you think that would have? And now remember, we've got the disc in between. As I'm asking you this, you can see the little blue disc in between, right? So if you're thinking about it, you're looking at the vertebrae, they create these curves, and then you see these discs in between. The intervertebral disc is what we call them. So intervertebral disc. So guys, just try to guess. What's the purpose? Why isn't our spinal column, why isn't it a straight, just a straight spinal column? Why does it have to have curves? What do you guys think? Any guess is good. Why do you guys think that there's curves in our spinal column? What purpose does that serve? What does it allow, or what does it provide?
I think it's so we can bend and move around.
Okay, so bending, think about the bending because there's different segments. I want you to think of it that way. The segments allow for the bending. Let's see what everybody says. So movement, a lot of you guys are going to say movement. And I agree, a movement is something, yes, someone answered cushions, okay? The cushioning effect of this, or the protection of it. So think about this. What if your vertebral column was straight and you were running and you've got these intervertebral discs in between? Don't you think the pressure would be all on one spot? So if you were a straight line, right? And you're running and you've got these discs in between and they're like jelly donuts, for example. Don't you think the pressure would be more focused, and then it's, as opposed to spreading the pressure across, because you've got a good curve, so then the pressure is weighted out, it's evenly dispersed, I should say. So I want you to think about this, okay? If you were straight, and maybe this will make sense for some of you, maybe it won't make sense for some of you, but if you were just a straight spinal column, all that pressure is going to be located on all that force in one spot. Does that make sense? So if we create a curve, then the pressure is distributed throughout, okay? So that's why those curves are really good. However, the movement part that you've mentioned, of course, if we were straight, then obviously the movement, I agree, the movement wouldn't be great, but the segments also help with that movement, okay? If you have a segment, you can move better, right? But here you're thinking about movement because of the shape, the curve. But you're really thinking about the majority of what it's doing is it's dispersing the pressure, because if we were straight, all that force would be right in one spot and those discs would for sure rupture, okay? Hence why you guys are thinking about needing to go to a physical therapist or go to a chiropractor or go to somebody that's going to keep those curves in good shape, okay? But that's what they're there for, right? Just like when they do bridges, if they do a bridge and it's a straight bridge, they have to add a lot of support. It's a curved bridge, they don't have to add the amount of support they do with a very straight bridge, okay? You can think of it that way, but that's really what it's providing. The majority of it is providing a even dispersed pressure or force when you're moving, you're running, you're bouncing. That's really the goal. And of course, the discs are a support. And we're going to talk about the disc a little bit more in just a second. Okay. All right, let me clear this out. Okay, so we're going to look more at the vertebral column. I do want you to be able to see the sacrum and the coccyx at the bottom. So here's the sacrum. It's actually going to be fused of, I should say, a fusion of 5 vertebrae, okay? You can kind of tell that they're all fused together. They were vertebrae, but they're fused. The coccyx bone is a fusion of 3 to 5 vertebrae that creates the tailbone, okay? So that creates the tailbone. I'll clear this. All right. Now, we talk about the vertebrae. We've already talked about the type of cartilage that create the intervertebral disc. Please remember to call them, not just call them discs, but they're called intervertebral disc, okay? That's important to remember because they're in between the vertebrae. But you've got fibrocartilage that's found here. We talked about that, but when we talk about that fibrocartilage, it's really, it's interesting how the discs are made up. And if anybody's ever been to the doctor for a disc issue, they'll talk about this too. But the intervertebral discs are divided up by the annulus pulpus from the annulus fibrosus, okay? The pulpus it's like a jelly that's found inside of a donut. And the fibrosis is like a fibrous outside of that jelly donut. If the fibrosis tears, then the pulpus, the pulp inside, okay, which is what it's named for, will come out, okay, because it's like a jelly that's inside. So if you think about it, once again, if the vertebral column was really straight, then all that pressure would go on those discs in one spot, and then it would push that jelly out, for example. All right, see a question. Hold on, let me check it out. Oh, you're good. So I want you guys to keep in mind that these discs are formed like a jelly donut. You don't want that pressure in one area. That's why the curves are good. Of course, the curves allow for you already to be bent in one area or another that way, or one direction or another, to allow for you to, of course, be more movable in that one direction or the other. But the main function of those curves are to disperse the pressure. So these jelly donuts, these intervertebral discs, don't rupture on you. And not to say that that doesn't happen, it does, okay? Could talk more and more about that, but I won't. Okay, so obviously the discs become drier as we age. We do activities that we probably shouldn't do as we age. Just our natural being of being at computers and all that the disc can rupture, okay? Now we're gonna look at the shape of the vertebrae, each one of them. So let's talk, I say each one of them, each category of vertebrae, let's put it that way. All right, let's talk about the cervical vertebrae to start. The cervical vertebrae are C1 through C7. And the only thing I really want you to first focus on when you think about the cervical vertebrae is C1 and C2 are very different than the rest of the vertebrae in the body, okay? So C1 is known as the atlas. It's what holds the head on, okay? So it is the atlas. It enables you to nod, to go yes, to nod yes. The axis is able to, and I should say it's very differently shaped, we'll look at it in a second, allows for you to pivot inside that atlas for rotation, okay? But they're, like I said, they're very, very different, okay? Atlas holds the head. It's like the Greek Atlas, you know what I mean? Holding the world above. Well, it holds the head. That's where it gets its name, okay? Because it holds the head. The axis C2 allows for an axis, a rotation to happen. That's where it gets its name, for rotation. It allows you to say no, okay? Or to turn your head no, okay? Now, I want you to be able to see this. I noticed this later after I put this on here, but this is the atlas, okay? It has a big vertebral foramen, very large. It is the largest because your brainstem is coming through here. You also have some things that are very similar to the rest of the vertebrae, like you're going to have a transverse process, for example, here and here, but they look very different, okay? You also have, you'll notice that you have some foramen, some holes that are going to allow major vessels to go through. So the atlas is going to hold the head, like I said. So you're going to be able to see these are facets that sit right here, or technically somebody call them condyles too on this one, but because they kind of create a projection and a depression for it to sit in. Okay, so when we look at the skull, you'll be able to see that too. That it actually sits in a little bit of a depression. So technically we can use condyles. Sometimes you'll hear facets because they're somewhat flat. Now, that was the atlas C1, and then C2 in this image is underneath. Do you see this? It's like a thumb-like ball projection, okay? That is part of the axis. It sits there and sits within with this little, they call it a dens or odontoid. Let me spell it out. I don't have my pad with me. I apologize. This is really sad. I'm trying this, but I'm going to trying to do it on a mouse on a laptop. Wow. Okay. Dens, you can write down dens. That's what this little ball-like projection that's sitting out is. And it's going to sit in and allow for the atlas to sit on top, to go back and forth to nod yes, and the axis with that little dens is going to stay in place with the dens, and it's going to allow for it to rotate left and right, okay? Also, here are the transverse processes that are found on the sides. And now you're being able to see more of a spinous process off of the back, other than it's bifurcated, meaning it has two little, and it's an easy way to tell this, but it's bifurcated. You had a very small spinous process off the back of C1, the atlas. But in C2, you're able to see that it's starting to bifurcate. It's not going to stay bifurcated like this. But now the general formation of the vertebrae as you go down are starting to appear, okay? So you've got your atlas, axis, C1 and C2, and you have what they do, okay? What's their function? All right. Now, let's scroll down so you can see the rest of them. So C3 through C7, lightest, smallest vertebrae, we're going to look at them. And C7 has a landmark that you can point out. You can feel it on your back right now. If you go down the back of your neck and you feel the biggest projection off the base of the back of your neck, that is the prominence, okay? That's how a lot of the orthopedists, the physical therapists, the chiropractors figure out how to count which vertebrae is which. They find the prominence, I should say, the landmark, okay, of C7. And that way they can count up or down from there. Okay, I'm gonna move down so you can see it. All right, so notice this is a cervical vertebrae, C3 through C7, okay? There's the spinous process off the back. That's what's listed here. It's a process, so it's projection. You also have, on the side, you have a little bit of the transverse processes. So it's listed here. It's already pointed it out. Here's from the side, you can see the spinous process, okay? Now, here's something you haven't seen till now. This is called the body, okay? This is the body. So that's the body. Like I needed to write that out, but that's okay. All right. And here, the vertebral foramen, so a big hole. Notice it's still really big for the spinal cord to go through, okay? I'm gonna clear that, we're gonna come down. So those are the cervical vertebrae. Now you're gonna be able to see in general what the rest of the vertebrae are gonna look like. They're just gonna be a little bit bigger. Well, they're gonna look a little different. We'll see in just a second. Okay, so here are the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, from the side, some people will say it looks like a giraffe, or I should say from the back or the top, kind of looks like a giraffe. It is, for example, larger than the cervical vertebrae. You can see that. And something that I want you to be able to see is there are facets off the spinous, or excuse me, off the transverse processes. These are facets, okay? What do you guys think that these facets attach to? A facet's going to be a flat surface of a bone that's going to attach to another flat surface of a bone. What do you think would attach there? What would be the other surface of bone it's going to articulate with? What do you guys think? Because it's in the thoracic area, right? It's a thoracic vertebrae. Okay, see some answers. Yeah, the ribs. So what is found here, this little facet here and here are going to attach, or I should say articulate, okay, with some cartilage to the ribs. Okay, so your ribs are attached to your thoracic vertebrae. Okay, all right, now notice there's a lot of the same features. You have the body, you have the transverse processes, that projection, and you have the spinous process, which is a projection, okay? Now, the spinous process from the back, you can see it's kind of coming down a little bit more, even though as you look at the body is a little thicker, or I should say thicker and wider, because as you go down, those discs, of course, they're getting bigger. You're having to hold more weight too. The other thing is look at the vertebral foramen. It's getting smaller. But you guys know we talked about the spinal cord. Well, and you've been able to see it and do some, actually learn about the spinal cord. It gets smaller as you go from the brainstem down. It gets smaller, 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 smaller until it finally ends around L2. Okay. But we're going to look at the lumbar. We're going to compare them. So I want you to be able to tell the differences between these C1, C2. C2 has the dens or odontoid we talked about. C1 looks like a very open ring. You get to the cervical vertebrae, they start to they're very small, but they start to show the shape. You get to the thoracic, they become a little bit bigger. They kind of look like, well, in my opinion, and we were in class looking at a model, this side of it looks kind of like a giraffe, kind of like these are the little horn-like things, and the eyes would be here. That's what it reminds me of, the thoracic, okay? And these look like these flappy ears over here for some reason, okay? I don't know, it looks like a giraffe. But anyway, so that's one way people remember it, is it just has that giraffe-like look, all right? So let's come down. Let's talk about the lumbar vertebrae, because they're different too. Now, hence I put on here massive block-like bodies, okay? Short and thick, okay? And the spinous process is extending directly backwards, but let's look at it because it is very hatchet-like. If I had to describe it, it's bigger, of course. Of course, it's bigger because most of the weight is placed here. Your spinal cord has gotten smaller, so the opening, the vertebral foramen, is very small. Remember, it ends at L2. And then, if you look at it, let's look at some of this. So it's like a hatchet back here. The body is awful big. I mean, look, it's huge. But your intervertebral disc are big because you have more weight in this area, okay? And then the hole back here, it's very small. And then from the side, it kind of looks like a moose. We would say in class, typically it looks like a moose. From this view, it kind of looks like an elephant, but we would always say it looks like a moose because this looks like big floppy ears from here. But you'll see some pictures in your book. You'll see as you do the hyperdoc and some of the imaging and videos, you'll be able to see this again. And notice, I mean, I feel like, I don't feel like the cervical vertebrae look like a mouse, but we usually say that it looks like a mouse. I don't feel like it's very accurate with that. But the thoracic look like a giraffe and the lumbar look like a moose. Okay, if you remember those as you look at them, you'll be like, oh, I see it, I see it. So it helps me even. All right, now let's talk about the sacrum and the coccyx. The sacrum is a composite bone, a fusion of 5 vertebrae. Okay, so let's look at it. Notice I put some notes on here just to kind of keep you guys aware. And I put on here the remnants of the spinous processes are called the sacral crest. But if you look at it, you can tell these were the spinous processes, okay? And then these were the transverse processes out to the side. So it's just like the vertebrae got fused, and that's literally what happened. So, and you can see it, all right? The coccyx is the bottom, very, very bottom here. It looks like a separation and then a fusion. And then the coccyx is really about 3 bones that are fused. The sacrum is 5 bones, and we say it's 3 bones for the coccyx, okay, the tailbone. Here's the back view of it. It's pretty cute. Hurts if you hit it. Okay, you don't really need to know much about it other than what it looks like, how many bones are fused. We're not going to ask you about the median sacral crest. Don't worry about learning that, okay? I did put that on there just to make you aware that that's just where the spinous processes fuse. That's what we call it. All right. So big thing is know what it looks like, and know how many bones or how many vertebrae are fused together for those, okay? Now I've got, I'm not going to run through all of these because I'm going to actually point them out, but we are going to talk about the bony thorax here next. So if I've listed here, it's made up of the sternum, ribs, the thoracic vertebrae. So this forms that rib cage, okay? And then of course you have the costal cartilage we're going to look at too. That's made up of hyaline cartilage that we talked about. The sternum, however, there are certain terms that make up this flat bone. I know you guys know where the sternum is, but it's a fusion of 3 bones. You need to know this, fusion of 3 bones. The manubrium, okay, looks like a knot of a tie. We'll look at it. The body, and something called the xiphoid process just means it's like a sword projection is what that term means, sword projection, okay? And we'll look at the ribs here in a little bit. You'll need to know what we name the ribs. We name the ribs by their attachments, what they're called. So let me clear this and go down so you can see it. Okay. So I've got this listed here via the ribs, but the ribs, there are 12 pairs. You'll have questions about that, I'm sure. 12 pairs. They're going to articulate with the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, the first pair, you'll see this in a second, they're known as true ribs because they directly attach to the sternum. The next 5 pair are known as false ribs. They indirectly attach to the sternum through the 7th, I should say, 7th costal cartilage. Okay. And then rib pairs 8 through 10 are called vertebrochondral ribs because they indirectly attach. They're false ribs also. But the very last ribs, and this will make sense in the image, I promise, it sounds confusing like this, but are called floating ribs. They have no attachment. So the 11th and 12th rib is a floating rib. They're 11th and 12th pairs that are floating. Okay, let me clear this and I'll show it to you. Because writing that out and reading it makes no sense, but seeing the image makes a ton of sense. All right. So here we go. Here are the true ribs. Here's 1, here's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They all, and I'll show you, they all directly attach here to the sternum. Okay. You guys can see that. Okay. Tell me if for some reason you can't see that, I would want to know. False ribs, 8 through 12 are the false ribs. They are indirectly attached. So that was the 7th. This is 8, 9, 10, and there's 11, and there should be, let's see, the floating down here should be 12 somewhere. Anyways, this image is not very bright, or I should say too bright. It's not very darkened to see everything, but let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then there's 12. Okay. All right, so now we can see 8 through 12 are not attached. Here's that dividing line through here. And then, of course, you can see the ones at the bottom aren't attached, but 8 through 10, so 8 through 10 right here are indirectly attached. And then you've got one back here that makes 11, and then 12 are floating ribs that are also classified as false ribs, but there are false ribs that are floating. Let's put it that way. So you've got 7 true ribs. You have 8 through 12 are going to be the false ribs, and 11 and 12 are going to be the floating ribs. Does anybody have questions about that? So 1 through 7 are true ribs, 8 through 12 are false ribs, and out of those false ribs, the 11th and 12th rib is a floating rib. Okay. Now, what I want to show you up here, this thing is called the manubrium. It's like a knot of a tie. That's the manubrium. Okay. A knot of a tie. Okay. That's part of the sternum. This right here is called the body. Okay. See, these are listed over here. And then down here is the xiphoid process. It's like a sword. It's a sword projection, is what we've called it. Okay, so there are 3 bones that make the sternum. These are the 3. The xiphoid process is, I don't want to say known for this, but it is known to happen. if somebody was to do CPR on you, the xiphoid process could break off and it could go through a lung or it could go through, part of the heart. So the xiphoid process is something you don't want to like press on unless you were doing CPR on somebody and you could break it, for example, just like you can break the ribs. All right, the other thing I wanted to mention down here is the costal cartilage. Why do we have hyaline cartilage throughout attached to the ribs? What purpose does that serve? Why do I need hyaline cartilage attached to these ribs? What purpose does that serve? What is the body trying to do? Okay, let's see what you guys said. Yeah, so someone said, so the thoracic cavity can expand and retract because, and it makes sense, right? Because the lungs are here and the lungs are going to expand and they're going to contract. They're going to do both of these things. And so if the rib cage was all hardened and calcified and all bone, then you couldn't allow for that expansion and contraction, okay? So we need movement. So it's allowing for a little bit of movement there, okay? So just be aware that that's why that's there, because the lungs are going to have to expand and contract. You're going to talk about that in AMP2, how that works, why they do this, how they do this kind of thing. But for right now, know that they expand to take in the oxygen, to take in the air, I should say, in inhalation. And then you're going to expire, okay, remove it when they contract and recoil, which is going to allow for the ribs to expand out and recoil in, okay? And that's the function of that hyaline cartilage. All right, let's move down. Okay. Now, the next part we would go into, we're actually going to go into for, well, I should say a few weeks from now, when we go over the muscles of the axial skeleton. We're going to focus on those. I will come back to this because this is all broken up. Do not do anything with the muscle section. I do not have much, as you see here, that's left, but we're going to use this for our muscles for the musculoskeletal axial portion. All right. Do you guys have any questions about anything we've gone over? Okay, so that is all of the axial skeleton. Some of the things that you're going to have on the hyperdoc that you're going to have to answer will be related to these bones, for example. You're going to have to really dig into your book. I know we've talked about them. We've spent some time looking at the general bones, what they're named, and then just looking at their location in general. We've talked about the markings. We've talked about bones in general, the hyaline cartilage. We've talked about all of the axial skeleton, the vertebrae. But you're going to have some questions related to these bones specifically. Let's put it that way. And that's what's going to you're going to answer on the hyperdoc. So let's go over to the hyperdoc so you can see it. All right. Back. Okay, and the hyperdoc is not bad. I think it's kind of short. So I think you guys will be pretty pleased. Okay. I don't know why it's not going down. Here we go. So the hyperdoc, here's like the first couple of questions. You're going to watch a video, main regions of the axial skeleton, which we talked about. Why is it named? You're going to look at the video. Why is it called the axial skeleton? Okay. Then here's questions about bone shapes that we've discussed. And then you're going to answer things about the markings. Okay. And then here we go. Bones of the skull. So you'll go and you'll look at this, the bones of the skull, and you'll answer the markings on those bones. So I pointed them out to you, but you'll have to answer a little bit more detail. Let's go down. Okay, we've talked about the hyoid, cervical vertebrae, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, and coccyx. So you'll have to, we've already looked at these structures, but as you see them, a lot of them are listed that you can see that you should already recognize. And then, of course, the sternum, we talked about true, false, floating ribs. And then there's going to be some questions about the bones of the skull, just to get you a little bit more aware of what are these markings, where are they found, what are the function of these markings, for example. Some of these things we've talked about, but as you go through the HyperDoc, it will direct you a little bit more. And that's it. That's all of the HyperDoc. Okay, so it's pretty short. Do you guys have any questions? Because Mr. Anderson's going to actually jump on and he's going to answer some questions about the exam. So let me know. Do you guys have any questions? Because I'm going to allow him to jump on. Okay, no questions. So I'll let him know. Okay, so he's going to jump on and he's going to go over some things with you with the exam, and you can ask him some questions real quick. All right, so just give him just a little bit. All right. So we're going to wait on him. Do you guys have any questions about the HyperDoc, anything about the handout? Reach out to me. Now, you guys, of course, in 2 weeks, you're going to present your group projects. If you have questions about your group, if somebody's not responding, somebody's dropped the class, like I had mentioned before, let me know. If I need to reassign something because something extra needs to get done, just, notify me that. And then we'll get that settled out. If you guys have questions or need help with the presentation part of it, sharing your screen, you're unsure about using PowerPoint, you're unsure about how to, go through things with a shared screen. If you're uncomfortable with Zoom, period, or you're uncomfortable with WebEx, or you're uncomfortable with whatever program that you're going to use, just let me know. Reach out to me and I'd be happy to go over that with you guys, or to be able to just let you guys practice. That's a little bit preferable, just, letting you guys just to get on and just go, hey, does this look right to you? Can you see this? When I share my screen, does this look right? Those are things that, go ahead and reach out to me, let me know, go ahead and practice with it, practice with your group. So if it's an issue, you can go ahead and let me know before you have to present it. All right. Next week, we're going to go over the skeletal system too. You guys won't have a ton. That's going to be the appendicular, the appendages, everything that attaches to the axial skeleton. So we'll finish that up. After you do your group presentations, we'll have the rest of muscles for musculoskeletal 1 and 2 divided up like we did the skeletal system. And then we'll have one more lab and then you guys will be done. So, which is absolutely amazing. All right. I've let him know that we are waiting on him to jump on. Okay. So he's going to be here in just a second, he said. But he's going to go over, I believe, the written portion of the exam and some of the little details with it. So you guys can ask him some questions while we have him here. And then if anything, let's see, if anything that you have an issue with, like later you have questions about, just let me know, even if he hasn't gone over it tonight. Yes, if you guys want to email me and just let me know if you have an issue with reaching out to somebody. For example, you think that they have dropped the class, then I will go in and I will look and I will let you know if something needs to be done a little bit differently. Okay, so let me make him our host.
Hey, everyone.
Here he is. Awesome.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Okay. You are welcome.
Cool. So, hey, everyone. I have, let's see, a question in the chat I can field. No, you don't have a midterm, just the unit exams and the final exam, Alexis. So you guys should be able to get into your Unit 2 exam to look at the questions and answers. And remember to do that, you just go to the assessments, just click on activities and assessments in eLearn. And then when you see Unit 2 exam electronic portion, click on the arrow next to it. And that'll pull up a menu, and then you go to submissions and you should be able to get to your attempt. Right. And right now, just let me know if there are any mistakes that I made, or you have, like it's a free response question and you put the plural instead of the singular, and it didn't, you didn't get credit for that and stuff like that. Just check my work and check your work. And if there are any other specific questions you have, I'm happy to answer them. If you would like to go over your exam in a lot of detail, like question by question, or you have a lot of questions about why you missed something, probably best to schedule a meeting with me so we can do that privately instead of in front of the class. But let me know if you guys have any questions or you have any issues getting into your exams, and I will help you out as best I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
All right, guys, reach out to me if you have any questions about the group presentation or anything about the HyperDoc, anything that I need to go over. If members have dropped the class, if you have a question about that, I know that came up, just reach out to me, shoot me an email, and I'll kind of let you know and help you better direct, where to focus your energy before the group presentation. All right, thank you guys, and let me know if you have any questions about the HyperDoc, guys. All right, later. Bye. Thank you, Michael.
See you later. Have a good night.
You too.